Hey readers and writers, I'm Adron Buske, and you're listening to Fictitious, a podcast about the storytelling craft of science fiction and fantasy. This episode was recorded live at Emerald City Comic-Con in Seattle, Washington on March 14th, 2019. It's a brand new panel discussion I debuted at Emerald City called Story Unlimited, using non-traditional methods and media to tell your story. Do you have a story to tell, but struggle writing that traditional novel, comic, or screenplay? Modern media presents you with extraordinary new options to tell your tale and win an audience. Whether it's a podcast, video series, webcomic, RPG, chat and text story, indie game, serialized mobile fiction, mystery box subscription, or something completely new, your potential fans are waiting. And why limit yourself to just one platform? I moderate this panel of writers about the evolving world of multimedia entertainment and how you can break in with your own stories. My speaker guests are David Ocampo, writer of the comics Lost Angels and The Margins, Gwenda Bond, author of Stranger Things' Suspicious Minds, and a guest on Fictitious in episode 6 of this season, Rob Hart, author of the Ash McKenna series, and Brian McClellan, author of the Powder Mage trilogy. While our discussion isn't strictly about sci-fi and fantasy, it offers a lot of valuable information about writing for different media. In an evolving marketplace that's hungry for storytelling across a variety of platforms, you just might discover the right avenue for your own writing. This is the Story Unlimited. Oh, that's my face really huge. There we go. Title. Story Unlimited, using non-traditional methods and media to tell your story. The things that we want to explore here today is finding ways that you can take ideas and properties and stories that you would like to express that maybe don't fit perfectly into a traditional media landscape as far as like just straight publishing as a novel or a short story or maybe even comics. But there are a plethora of other options out there and available to you, and new ones emerging all the time, which give you opportunities to tell those stories in new and fun ways. So what I did is I went out and found some writers and creators that were doing some interesting stuff in different places, and that we can explore how they got into that. And so we can kind of find out like how they balance a career doing like the traditional work with doing things like outside of that, and how they feel about some of those new and emerging platforms, services, genres, and other story mediums. My name is Adron Buske. I am the host of a show called Fictitious, which is about the storytelling craft of science fiction and fantasy. Gwenda was actually just a host on that show not too long ago. Oh, a guest. You took over. Like once she came in, I was just like, let the blue-haired gal do it. She's got this handled. But if you are interested in storytelling and learning how to do it, whether it's for hobby or career, or if you're just a person who likes to read and wants to know what happens in the minds of creators, you should check that show out. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to start right here with Dave, and I'm going to go down and each introduce yourselves and then just give a real brief overview of your greatest hits collection of your work.
All right, so clearly I'm David Ocampo, and I think at this point I'm mostly a graphic novelist. I've got The Margins, which I think he had up on screen there. I also am known for a book called Lost Angels that came out a few years ago. We're working on the second volume of that now. The other thing people may know me from is an audio drama that I did for a number of years from like 2007 to 11 called Wormwood, a serialized mystery.
I'm Gwenda Bond. My most recent book is Stranger Things, Suspicious Minds. And I also wrote a trilogy of books about young Lois Lane in high school. And a bunch of other stuff, including a serial called Dead Air with Rachel Kane, who's also here, and Carrie Ryan, that had a serialized component and also a scripted podcast that went along with it.
My name is Brian McClellan. So I write flintlock epic fantasy novels, big, thick mofos, like Game of Thrones kind of things. I have, I'm mostly known for the Powder Mage universe, which is about mages who snort gunpowder, which is pretty cool to get their magic. I actually am branching out a little bit. I've got an urban fantasy self-publishing in 2.5 weeks, called Uncanny Collateral. It's actually my cover that's up there when it flips around to me. And that's about a collection agent who works for Hell, and it's a new thing. Cool.
Hi, my name is Rob Hart. I have written 5 private detective novels. I wrote a short story collection that I call my food noir collection that was all stories that had both an element of crime and food to them. It's called Takeout. I co-wrote a novella with James Patterson called Scot Free. And my next book, which is up there, is The Warehouse, which is coming out in August, which got optioned for film by Ron Howard, which is still a really bizarre thing to say. And there are galleys of it down at the Random House booth if anyone wants to go try to grab one.
It's a big flex, optioned by Ron Howard. I would just drop that casually, like, no big deal. It's just a thing that happened.
I got nothing. It's just it's the weirdest thing that's ever happened. So I keep on saying it, hoping that if I say it enough, it actually will be real.
My first book got optioned by Kelsey Grammer, and
Really?
so for a while I'd be like, Kelsey Grammer's walking it into MTV. It was an actual sentence that was said to me once.
Did that get lost in development hell?
Oh
Is it still
yeah,
happening,
they
or?
fired the head of MTV and put a new person in their place, as it happens.
That's the beauty of getting things optioned, is that sooner or later studio heads get fired. That happens every 3.5 weeks or so. And then an intern who was getting coffee 6 months ago then runs the company, and they get to call the shots on what gets made next. So if you ever wonder why studios do those, like, oh my God, why'd they do that stupid? That's why, because the intern who was getting coffee now runs the place.
And always be nice to the interns.
Always be nice to the intern. They will be your boss eventually, yes. So, I mean, all you guys have released things through like traditional media, but like you said, and Brian, I don't think you even mentioned that you have an RPG.
Oh yeah, I do have an RPG.
Yeah, which is why you're here. But, in the Powder Mage universe. So, I want to explore a little bit at when you've worked outside of just the traditional prose, whether it's doing like the audio dramas and doing, stuff online, doing the RPG, all that kind of stuff. What drew you to some of those other media? Why did you make those choices? And did it come as this was my best avenue to try something new, or was it work for hire? Like, how did that happen? And we can start with Dave, and then we can bounce around.
Yeah. So, I mean, my whole writing career has been this, and I'm sure everybody has a similar path, but it's kind of largely born out of necessity and what's available at the time. So, I mean, I graduated from school with a degree in creative writing. First thing I published was a literary short story. I always loved comics, but I didn't know how to break into comics. I don't think anybody does. And every story is different. So what happened was I ended up moving to LA. I got involved writing screenplays. That turned into producing our own short films. And if you've ever made any films, you know that that's like a massive endeavor just to get like 10 minutes of talking heads or whatever it is you get with your short film. And while I was doing that, I was listening to podcasts. It was like I had my, second or third generation iPod, and was discovering podcasts for the first time. And I basically, kind of said, we have a global distribution platform right here. I have lots of actor friends in LA who would love to just be able to speak and wear sweatpants while they're doing it and not have to sit around and wait for their shot, which is going to be 5 seconds of running down a hallway and then cut, and then they got to sit around for another hour. And so what we found is that we had this avenue, and we basically took a little bit of profit of money we raised from one of our short films and bought audio equipment, not knowing any idea of really how to mix the audio or anything, and became what I kind of consider to be the garage band era of podcasting, where this is before Welcome to Night Vale and We're Alive and all these other podcasts that have since become huge, and we never really figured out how to monetize it. I will say that right now, but it was a stepping stone for everything else. So it was just something where I wanted to tell longer stories, and I was willing to ditch the picture in order to tell like a long form serialized story, because I loved Twin Peaks and X-Men comics and all the soap opera things that I grew up with. And so it was a great way for me to do all that, and all I had to do is figure out how to tell stories with audio and music and sound effects.
Wormwood was like probably the first podcast audio drama that I heard, because I think you were kind of a little ahead of the curve with it.
We definitely were ahead of the curve. If the curve is where you get paid, we were far ahead of the curve. I think there was maybe one other example that I had seen when I was setting out to do it, and I don't remember the name of it. But we came along, and I sort of said, I want to do what's a modern TV show that just doesn't have the picture, So I was thinking of things that I wanted to do that were like Twin Peaks and Buffy the Vampire Slayer, and slam them together. And then but really for us, in talking about Story Unlimited, it was about, okay, if we're going to take this on, we've got to understand the medium. And we went and did our research, and we went and listened to old radio shows and stuff like that, just to kind of understand what we were doing, and then just basically bumbled our way through it after that,
Gwen, you've worked in audio drama, like you said, and I feel like you came into it from a very different angle because you had a platform behind it. How did that all work?
So I've always been obsessed with the thing that appeals to me about stories that bring in multimedia kind of approaches is how immersive they can be. And I think in particular, I was listening to and watching a lot of true crime, like many people, and thinking about the ways in which people become obsessed with those stories and the real drive that people have to get involved in solving cold cases. And it seemed like there was an opportunity to do a story that would focus on a podcaster solving a mystery and then also do the podcast component. And I happen to know this company, Serial Box. I don't know if anyone's familiar with them, with an S, not a C. And they are a serialized storytelling platform that does an audiobook, ebook, and weekly episodes, and they put together a writer's room for each episode. And so I was essentially had this idea and pitched it to them, and they loved it. So I got to sort of choose the writers I wanted to work with and be kind of the showrunner on this. And they hired all the actors, and I got to help cast all the parts, and they composed music for the podcast. And it was a real learning experience for all of us, though, because three of us were novelists who were obsessed with podcasts and listened to them a lot, and I've always been an old radio person. And we just really wanted to create something where you could get a complete story from, sort of the novel and chapters and the podcast, but you could get more than a complete story if you did both at the same time. So it was a really interesting experiment and very, very fun and creatively fulfilling, I think, to do. And also, I always joke, I mean, it's sort of true, though. One of the reasons I didn't feel like this was right for a YA novel was because really it's also all about ethics and journalism. But really, we were all really fascinated with the questions of the ethics of investigating true crime cases and them as entertainment. And so this felt like a way to kind of interrogate our own fascinations with them in fiction.
I think it's a really interesting note because do any of you guys listen to true crime stuff, in podcasts and whatever? There's a few out there that really straddle that line between journalism and just straight up inserting themselves into the narrative in a way. There's one called Up and Vanish that I feel like is nearly unethical in the way that they handle things. And I like the way that your show kind of took that and explored that.
It's interesting. There are a lot of questions there. Yeah.
Brian, you've got a popular fantasy series and you've got this really well-developed world. And then, I think a lot of times when I talk to people who write fantasy or sci-fi that have these well-developed world-building kinds of things, they're rife with potential for playing it as a game. So how did that happen with Powder Mage?
Powder Mage was kind of funny because I had basically a designer come to me and say, hey, I'm a fan of yours. Would you want to team up and do an RPG? And, I kind of being young and stupid, I was like, yeah, that's a great idea. And so we set the whole thing up. It took us a couple of years to get to the point where we actually did a Kickstarter for it. And the Kickstarter went through. It was a great success. Then I had a bunch of stuff I actually had to do. How Kickstarters work. And it was a bunch of stuff that was kind of outside of my wheelhouse, which is what made it interesting. I'm very good at writing narrative. I write 200,000-word epic fantasy novels. I put out one a year and I don't work very much. I have a very relaxed schedule. And so that's kind of how I've always been used to things. And then I was suddenly tasked with writing about 40,000 words of RPG content. And I thought, yeah, I'll knock that out in a couple weeks. That'd be easy. And then I found out that writing content for an RPG is a totally different beast. And it took me forever. I was behind on one of my books, which is my bread and butter. And so I had to put the book first. But I always had that the RPG in my mind. And then I finally got to the RPG, and it took me 6 to 8 months instead of a few weeks like I thought. So it was really eye-opening on how different writing, even for just different audiences, really changes how you approach it and how hard it is. By the time I was finished, it was coming smoothly, and it was really cool. And I was like, oh, I probably could keep writing and do more. But, it's because I was kind of flexing those muscles. But commissioning art and things like that was also kind of what I basically had to do. And so learning all those different skill sets across different mediums, it's both fun and challenging. So I have kind of a weird situation going on right now with Uncanny Collateral, the book that I just told you about. Because 2 summers ago, I was in LA meeting with my TV and film agent, and we were talking about my Powder Mage books. And he said at the end of the meeting, he said, what else do you have on the back burner? And I said, oh, well, I've had this idea for years about a collection agency that works for hell. And I really wanted to do something with this. And he kind of squinted at me. He's like, would you write that? Because I can sell that really easily. And so, I'm under contract for Powder Mage. So I'm working on that. But in the back of my head, I've had different drafts going through of this story about this collection agency. And I finally got around to it last summer. And I wrote it. And it's only about 45,000 words. I can't remember if that's technically a novella.
It's a novel light.
It's a little tiny novel, and it's urban fantasy. And so my agent loved it, and she sent it to my TV and film agent, who said, "This is awesome. I'm going to start working on this." And she sent it to publishers, and publishers all said, "This is too short. This is urban fantasy. We want nothing to do with it. We love the fact that you sell hundreds of thousands of epic fantasies. Keep doing that." And so I'm winding up self-pubbing the only thing I've ever gotten serious TV and film interest in that I'm not allowed to talk about yet.
Oh, publishing.
It's a really weird thing, but it also means that I was able to self-publish it, and I'll get more money out of it. And I also was able to hire an amazing audiobook reader for it and to do cool cover art. And I sunk almost 10 grand into producing the book, which is normally what a publisher would do. But I'm also going to make more money off of it. And it's interesting, and I like interesting.
Rob, you've got the sort of the traditional writing, you've got the screenwriting, all that stuff, but you also run some stuff online.
Yes.
You're covering all of your bases. Can you kind of talk about some of those other sidebars you have in your writing career?
Yeah, so there are two main things I do. One is I work for a website called Lit Reactor, where I run the online writing workshops. My day job is I run MysteriousPress.com, which is an offshoot of Mysterious Press, which is owned by Otto Penzler, who owns the Mysterious Bookshop in Manhattan. And he started that probably about 8 or 9 years ago with the idea of taking all these old crime and mystery books that were not available anymore and putting them out in digital formats, which we had a great time doing. I learned a lot. Charlotte McLeod, who I had literally never heard of, who writes these really great cozy mysteries, sells a crazy amount of books. And we've tried to experiment a little bit with different formats. We've tried to bring back some Black Mask stories. We tried to bring back some Police Gazette stuff with varying degrees of success. And when I say varying, more not success. But it's always been interesting to me to sort of work on both sides of the publishing spectrum. I think that's why my editors like me, because I'm slightly less needy. They probably wouldn't agree with that.
Brian, there was something that you mentioned while you were talking that I want to kind of approach everybody with the group, which is like it's the flexing of different muscles and exploring these new challenges. In some of this different stuff that you've done, what are some of those places where you were talking about, like in the RPG, where you found that you had a roadblock at first for figuring out? With the rest of you, like, and Brian as well, like, what were some of those challenges that you hit writing in different methodologies, whether it's screenplays or traditional prose and stuff? And how did you get around those, or what did you learn that helped out your process?
I had a hell of a time writing with Patterson. They started this what were called book shots, and they were going to be like short novella-length stories that were going to come out. They were going to do like 5 or 6 a month. And I knew an editor who was involved in that. We were talking at a conference. He's like, "Well, why don't you put your name in for this?" And so they picked me. And it was like 30,000 words, and you had to write them in like 10,000 word increments. And I passed the first test, which is like I gave them like a pitch for the story I wanted to tell after they kind of gave me a framework. And I wrote the first 10,000 words, and they called me up, and they were like, "Nope, this is not good." And that was the worst feeling ever, because I had already cashed the first check. But and I was going to the American Library Association conference that weekend in Boston, and spent the entire 4-hour train ride up and the entire 4-hour train ride back rewriting those first 10,000 words. And I will say, Patterson is successful for a reason. Like, that dude is just a master storytelling technician. There were things that I never even thought about that he was pointing out. Like my favorite example, this is one of my favorite nuts and bolts pieces of advice I ever got, is I had one character tackling another, and it it felt like he got hit by a cannonball. And he's like, "No one knows what it feels like to get hit by a cannonball and lived. You have to use things that people understand." And I was like, oh, that should have been really obvious. It was not, but it really is obvious. And it was a huge.
There's a human cannonball knows what it feels like to get hit.
Yeah,
by
Yeah.
But that was just a huge growing experience for me as a writer. It was kind of a bummer because the book shots thing did not work out. They're not really doing those anymore, and part of the reason is because they were putting out like 5 or 6 a month, and booksellers were like, "We just can't turn over this much material. Like, this is crazy." So so
They
I
were
did
trying
my
to do
one.
like the comics model, but with prose. That's
Essentially, yeah.
And one of the first things they announced was the murder of Stephen King, which they then had to cancel almost immediately. Our friend was a writer on that, and I'm like, what were you thinking?
I talked to him
I
after
know
he felt
loved
so
it, Derek.
bad.
I know Derek.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, but
It
Derek.
was like it was a very affectionate thing.
I know.
Yeah,
But
and
it's like still, you got to take a step back sometimes. And so, to your point, the first thing I thought of this answer to this question is collaboration. Like, you always learn a ton collaborating with new people. I also co-write books with my husband, and then I've worked on comics and then with Carrie and Julian and the team at Serial Box and Rachel. And you do learn something new from every person that you collaborate on a story with. And it's very important to choose your collaborators wisely is one of the things that you learn, because there's nothing worse than people who have vastly different, irreconcilable views of what something should or could be. You know, you want people who you learn to be flexible and try to find a third way when you disagree with people you collaborate with, because there's a reason why you don't agree. And usually the solve will be better than the solution that either one of you had to begin with.
I put an addendum in there that, like, whenever you're approaching collaboration, that you should explore all the aspects of what a project is together before jumping into it. Because a lot of times people will be like, oh, we like the same things, our writing style's compatible, or like, you know, this will work. But they might find after they've written the thing that their idea of marketing, what they want for covers, who the real intended audience is, stuff like that, might be totally different.
Point.
Yeah, and you can pull yourself into a mire really quickly, or just, you know, managing how you get paid and how you will handle who owns the property after the fact, and if it gets optioned, who actually gets to control it and stuff like that. So it can be tough.
I think for me, playing off of what you were talking about with collaboration, I mean, obviously, almost all of my stuff is collaborative in some way. I haven't written novels yet, so for me, I've got, you know, an artist co-writers, but also artists that I'm working with, or actors that I'm working with in the various different projects. And you're absolutely right. You learn something from every one of those. But again, I come back to, you know, it's about knowing that medium. So for us, going from film, you know, so I went from like writing prose to learning how to write screenplays with a friend, a co-writer, and that really helped me there and kind of being able to visualize that and figure that out. From there, going into an audio drama was about both of us figuring out, okay, you've got tools in the toolbox, but you've got to figure out the best way to use them. If you want to create a creepy monster, you've got sound effects, but that can only take you so far. So you need a witness. You need somebody that can tell you the story of what that creature looks like. And it can't sound, you know, the first thing you do is you write, oh my God, you're oozing pores or whatever it is, right? And it's horrible. And you have to figure out ways to get in and tell that story without using the picture. And there are ways, like storytelling is one, sound effects is another, and it's really all about the back and forth dialogue. Now, one of the strengths with Wormwood was our Dr. Crow, our protagonist, who is a former psychologist who is now an exorcist, this washed up exorcist. What we really did and what we really learned that our actor could do is perform wonderful monologues. He could do this twisty rant. Then the way I got into comics is essentially an artist came to me and said, hey man, I've been listening to your podcast, Wormwood. I really like it. I drew some pages from it. I adapted it. And we're like, wow. I mean, I've always loved comics. It's the first thing I ever wanted to write and draw. And I'm like, this is great. But we can't adapt Wormwood. That's knowing your market, right? I can't imagine someone, an unknown, you know, getting to do a 24-issue comic off the bat. So we need to do a 5-issue miniseries. We have a prequel built in. We start the series knowing that the exorcist has failed to exorcise a mob boss's daughter, and he has to leave LA because of that. So we're like, we'll go back and tell that story. And that was a lot of fun, but then we had to learn, okay, Dr. Crow can't sound the same anymore. We have to find a way. If we did one of his monologues, it would cover up all of the art. You know, and so you learn how to kind of clip that and get a little more like rat-a-tat back and forth banter. That's okay, because you can kind of put two characters here in the page and then put stuff between them. But your artist has to know the person that speaks first needs to be on the left. So the first word balloon goes here. And so there's all these little things that you can learn, and you need to know them. The audience can tell when you're a screenwriter coming into comics if you haven't taken the time to kind of figure out what comics do really well. And same with novelists. And I think novelists are getting a lot better at it. But I remember, like, back in the day, you would know when they brought a novelist in, they would way overwrite and way overdescribe and not let the art tell the pictures.
Yeah, novels and comics are almost opposites in some ways, and screenplays too, because novels are all about the inside of people.
Exactly. And so for me, it's carrying that through with every project. I mean, my latest thing, and I haven't been able to announce this yet, but I can say it right now, is that I'm writing an interactive mobile game, or I just finished it, and it is based on the film 16 Candles. It is a sequel to 16 Candles set in like 1985. It's going to be a mobile phone game. And I got that job from Desiree Proctor, who was on one of your panels last year here. We met
narrative fiction writer. Yeah.
That's right. We met in the DC Comics Talent Development Workshop. We were both in the 2016 class, and we become friends since then. And she's like, I'm doing this new game. And then she left to go and do a Disney show. But she's like, do you want to jump in on this? I think you'd be good. And she had read, what I had done with Lost Angels, which is a teenage show or comic. And so I kind of had this audition. And we're talking about RPGs and stuff. Like my interview was talking about me being a dungeon master and me writing comics and how all those things matter, because this is a mobile game where you're going to have text balloons popping up. And I know how to write sparse dialogue and make that work. But I also know how to create this branching interactive narrative. But that was a whole new set of skills that I had to learn for that. It's a fascinating project. You're female, but you can choose if you're bi, straight, or gay, so that your crushes, whose names are going to be either Jamie, Corey, or Akasa, can be either male or female, depending on what you chose.
And you bring into something like that, it has interactivity and more. When you're writing a novel, you're telling a story. It happens in the mind and imagination of the reader, but you are telling a story. In any interactive format, then they are participating in it. I mean, Brian, again, in an RPG, you experienced that because you were writing for that. Was that part of what was the challenge in flipping the switch over into writing an RPG?
Weirdly, one of the big things that is talked about on panels for epic fantasy a lot is world builder's disease. Which is just the idea of that you do too much world building and you've got so much content and you never actually write a story. I have the opposite problem in that I write a very narrow story, and I tend not to develop things that I'm not going to use. I keep on track. It's why I can write quickly. And so jumping over into a RPG is you kind of have to have world builder's disease, because you're creating bigger and bigger and bigger, and you're trying to flesh out this world in all these different corners that I never think about because they're not pertinent to my story. It took a long time for me to break through that to the point where I could spit out new names and things and places, because it's not something I think about. Narrative is what I think about constantly. And it's just such a different form of creating.
Did it change at all when you went back to your next novel? Did you find yourself?
Honestly, I think that it helped me kind of expand a little bit in terms of kind of restrained world building, which is what I've always tried to do. My biggest complaint about epic fantasy novels, which, I grew up reading epic fantasy, I love epic fantasy, is that they're so long and so boring in most of the parts. And that, as a reader, I always skimmed them. I loved them, but I skimmed them. I'd get to the good parts. And so when I started writing epic fantasy, I very specifically wanted it to read like urban fantasy. I wanted it to be quick, to move along, to be very focused, and not spend 7 pages describing a dress or a meal. That's kind of what I had trained myself to do. And so breaking that self-training was kind of weird, but fun, and it kind of helped me edge a little more towards a happy medium rather than the extreme spot I had been at.
There was a mention in here a little while ago talking about when you're writing for new audiences. Gwenda, you were talking about earlier, like you've written like the Lois Lane books, and you have novels, and you have a children's series, which is super cute, which is the Super Normal Sleuthing Service, yes. When you're crossing all these different channels, and then you're over into this like true crime kind of thing, are you carrying audience over with you? Is it
I hope
new?
So.
Yeah. Are new people discovering
But
you?
you're also hoping to expand always your audience with every project. And, I'm very easily bored, and I like consuming a lot of different types of media as a reader and as a viewer, as a writer. It just makes sense to expand into those things. And I do think that I think readers will follow the voice of somebody that they like. I think probably Dead Air was the biggest challenge, and we probably brought more new people in than people over just because it didn't have a speculative element, and that's the one thing that all of my other stories have, some sort of supernatural component to them. But yeah, no, I mean, the middle grade audience obviously is not following the adult stuff, I hope. Except for the Stranger Things book, which they are totally reading and learning all sorts of things about LSD use by the military.
It's an education. They should know about those things. Rob, in your experiences in publishing and stuff, I've seen things before where people have talked about staying in your lane, where they're especially in self-publishing, where there seems to be this benefit to getting a channel and staying in it. I mean, are you seeing that from your angle and from your own career, or does the diversification across a lot of different genres and stuff make more sense?
It's an interesting question because I think there are some authors who have done very well at that. Like you look at someone like Delilah Dawson or Chuck Wendig, who have sort of played in multiple genres, and they've done Star Wars stuff, and they've done, Delilah's doing comic books now. Like they're doing all these different things, and my impression from the outside is that it seems like their audience is following them. I also have friends who want to try to branch out into maybe YA, and they're just not seeing that same type of reaction or success. And I think that it's hard to sort of, you kind of have to build yourself a big groundswell of support, I think, before you start moving over, if you plan on carrying your audience over, because it's really, there are so many other things vying for attention. It could just be hard to get people to notice sometimes.
I think YA in particular, YA readers will follow creators they love elsewhere, but I'm not always sure, it depends on what your fan base is and wants, you know what I mean? So if you have an adult science fiction reading fan base, they're probably not going to follow you into middle grade or YA. So you're just developing a new audience there. Whereas your YA audience might follow you the other direction. So sometimes it's just which came first, and
Yeah, I started with crime, and now I'm kind of moving over to sci-fi. So I feel like people are going to kind of follow me.
I think that's right. Well, really I mean, that makes sense. That's people who would read both, right? Yeah.
Well, and there are types of readers as well.
Yeah.
There are the type of readers who will follow authors, and there are a type of readers who will follow universes.
Yeah.
And they don't give a shit what else you write.
Right.
They want you to keep doing this and doing it well, so that they can keep seeing it.
We see a lot of that in comics,
There's
a reason that Scott Snyder can write Batman and get all his followers there, and then he'll get a portion of them going over to his Image creator-owned book.
Right.
I mean, we just know that's the way it goes, because there are Batman readers and there's Scott Snyder readers, and they're all here, and some of them are going to go over, and some of them will check it out. But yeah, we see that a lot.
I like that you mentioned Chuck Wendig and Delilah Dawson, because these are writers that have built big platforms over time, often by one having big personalities, at least in the social space, but also because they spent a lot of time talking to other writers and creators and giving them stuff. At this point in time, how strongly do you feel about the need to have a presence, to have a name, especially if you want to do something, if you want to have a career in a lot of different lanes? How's your feeling about being a writer and creator in an era where you're supposed to kind of be a personality too?
I do think if you want to do these kind of works, if you want to do collaborative projects in particular and work in other kinds of media, you have to be someone that people want to work with. And that doesn't necessarily mean a public platform. It can just mean, developing a reputation over time. I think people who don't like doing social media or developing kind of their online thing are really bad at it. And so it's not going to work, and you're just going to pour all this time and energy into it. Focus on what you're good at and enjoy. I feel very lucky that I, actually enjoy that stuff and doesn't give me hives. But, I think there is this thought that everyone has to do that. But there are lots of ways to get your name out in the world, and the internet is only one of them.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. You can't force it. And I think it's becoming a little dangerous where especially newer, younger writers are being told or being made to feel like they have to have a platform or they have to have a voice right at the start. And it's well, no, you need really good work first, and then everything else will kind of come from that. A lot of those really big personalities and those really big voices, they started with a strong backbone of solid books or solid comics or whatever, and then everything just kind of flowed from that.
I've also seen a few times where I've seen young creators who have come in, got the first book or whatever property out, build a big following and then really stepped in it at some point because, they're inexperienced and, maybe a little naive about the publishing process or something like that. And then, the Twitter storms
Are you
happen.
talking about Joyce Carol Oates? No, it's not just the young ones. It's not just the young ones who step in it.
That's true. Well, and sometimes it's the war between the young and the old too. Like, I've seen a few times where it's like, clashes between it. Like, it's a weird thing to sit in an environment where like there are this many opportunities, but there are also just as many opportunities to screw up and take a misstep as well. Along with the stuff that you guys have done, what are you exploring other platforms and genres and stuff now? I mean, like Brian, I know you talked about you just writing your first urban fantasy, and Rob, you're breaking into science fiction and stuff. I mean, there's like a whole plethora of like storytelling platforms and stuff out that like I want to explore a little bit later into this. But is there anything that you've seen crop up lately where you're like, oh, I want to take a shot at this, or it doesn't have to be lately, maybe it's something that's been around for forever, but you just haven't done your thing yet with it?
I'm really interested to see more experiments in the like choose your own adventure space, like what Netflix did, like in a way that feels that felt fairly predetermined to me, like felt a little frustrating, like the 1.0 attempt at it. So I would love to do the right kind of choose your own adventure story because I think that there's a lot of possibilities there.
I went last fall, I went and bought all the equipment to start a podcast because I really wanted to. And then I figured out that I have no time because I have so much other junk going on. So I have all this equipment for a podcast sitting on my desk. And now in the last month and a half, and we're going to announce this anyways in the next probably 10 days. But me and my friend Dan Wells are developing a online streaming RPG that the pitch is going to be all writers, kind of the Critical Role, High Rollers D&D type of thing. And so that's a thing that I've been learning about a lot over the last month and a half or so, learning how to create that as a business. And Dan gets to create it as a creative thing. I was actually going to mention this with when we were talking about collaboration before, because we started talking about this a little while ago, and I realized at some point as we were forming the world that I have too big of an ego to work with somebody else on a creative project. And Dan's like a close friend. We've been gaming group together for years. He's an awesome writer, and I finally just said, I kept hearing myself every time he'd send me notes think, you're wrong and I'm right. And I realized that was horrible for both the relationship and the business prospect of this whole thing. And so I finally said, I recused myself. I was like, Dan, all right, if you need a little bit of, if you need like some basic looking over once in a while, that's great. But you're going to do creative, I'm going to do business. And otherwise, this is totally not going to work. And that helped propel us to like get to the point where we're going to make the thing happen rather than just an idea, because collaboration in general sounds like hell to me, like creative collaboration, because I've got like a singular vision of something and then a whole bunch of other people that could mess it up if they touched it. It sounds horribly egotistical, and it is, but it's also true. This is why, so many movies are garbage, is because you have 1,000 moving parts, and even the very best director can't make them all happen perfectly. It's a weird thing to be collaborating on something, even now that we've kind of separated our roles better, than to just me alone working on something that my editor and my agent and my wife will get to read and nobody else before it goes out.
Is there anybody out there that you're watching right now, another creator, another writer, that's doing something really interesting that you look at and you're like, oh man, that's kind of inspiring, or that's like, I wish I could go in a direction like that, or just in some way like makes you think this is a really cool way to take storytelling in a new direction?
I don't know the specific writer, but a buddy of mine is now doing it's like a by mail sort of like murder mystery game.
Yeah.
Yeah, and stuff like that is really interesting to me. It'd be nice to have more free time to explore that kind of stuff. But I actually think, and I'm curious to know what everyone else thinks, if I could just pose a quick question.
Yeah.
Like, I feel like people are just kind of getting bored of like normal narrative stuff, and I think that's why this stuff is starting to really click with people, because we've been through so many stories and so many storytelling techniques that it feels like we're getting to this point where we need those challenges and we need those sort of expansions. Does that make any sense?
I struggle with that one.
It's true, but then on the other hand, anytime you have a new format, getting people to try it is a difficulty. You know what I mean? Serials like relearning, teaching people how to engage with serialized stories again, even though they consume most of their media that way, to use an app to do it or to subscribe to the thing is probably your overhead is lower, right? So you can still make money. I mean, the business model is different for these things, right? But I think tried and true, like good old narratives will always, there is a comfort, and a lot of readers especially just want to pick up a book and they want it to, they want to fall into it. I mean, we never know. The generation that's coming up now have grown up with technology in a way that none of us did, and it's going to be amazing to see what they end up doing with that.
Yeah, that's kind of what I struggle with in that. I think I'm old enough that that traditional narrative is what I always go back to. I've had this long running conversation with a good friend of mine, with my co-writer on Margins, Paul Montgomery, where he's like, you got to check out this game. It's one of these walking simulator, it's a storytelling game. It's all about solving a mystery by going into this. In this particular one was a space station. I said, all right, I'll download it. I'll play it. I'll go through the whole thing and play the mystery. And I find myself getting frustrated with it at times. And I'm like, just tell me the story. I don't care. I don't want to pick which room I go in first and uncover the clues. And so I get frustrated with that because I'm like, as a writer, I think that's fascinating. I mean, doing this 16 Candles game was utterly fascinating. It's a huge amount of restrictions, in that you can't write sort of gendered humor. The humor had to be very specific. It's a problematic movie to watch now.
Oh, yeah.
And so one of the things going forward was, can we fix some of this? Which was really interesting. It was, can you redeem Long Duck Dong? Which I got to write the first scene with him, and I think I did.
Can that be the name of the whole thing?
The redemption of Long Duck Dong.
That was kind of like our secret name. In the end, we couldn't even use them, by the way. But probably not even supposed to talk about that. But but it was fascinating to kind of figure out how to do this, and it's a great exercise for writers because you're not only thinking through one path, but you're when we're writing, we're making those choices. But now you can't make the one choice. You've got to make three choices, and then you've got to rewrite. Does my main character react differently to person one, to person two, to person three? It's fascinating. Yeah. But at the same time, am I playing it? I don't know. I need to see who's playing it and kind of understand that, because I do struggle with that a bit. I want to add that in looking at platforms and stuff, I find myself, I'm sort of story agnostic when I approach a project, in that I have to go with my gut, and I have to know what are the stronger things and what makes the most sense. Kind of like I said, what's available to me, and what the story feels like. Lost Angels specifically was me thinking, okay, I want to tell a real comic book story, not something adapted from something I was doing in a serialized drama. And to me, that is, people with wings don't look right on film still to this day. Writers can describe people with wings, but it doesn't quite. But artists can draw amazing people with wings. And the other thing is, if you have wings, you don't need elevators or stairs, so you have this tall vertical city. And I said, now what if that city is essentially a ghetto, and all these angel people are trapped there in this immigrant culture, refugee culture in a way. And I said, now this is really interesting. And the other thing that occurred to me as I started thinking about, the main character, who would be a human girl who lives up in those towers, is I love that Frank Miller Daredevil bouncing off the flagpoles in Hell's Kitchen. That's something that comics can do so well, and they can do that acrobatic kind of. So the first scene was basically this little girl descending these towers in this silver city, and it's something I'm like, that's what comics can do. So this is a comic book right here, and
I really like that what you're hitting there, because the idea that when you're picking that medium or that genre or whatever, and you can do something that's quintessentially just that thing. It's like if you're writing audio drama and then you have the power of you can have a person monologue and it's fine, or you're using the sound effects, you're using the music. It's it's picking the right thing to tell the kind of story that you're trying to develop, because sometimes you do see something that you try to make the leap from one platform to another, and it doesn't work as well.
I think a lot of times you see this with people who try to resurrect ideas they had that were for TV shows, and they try to fit them into a novel, and it just doesn't feel right. I don't want to give examples. That would be really shitty.
Well, I mean, I can even say from my own stuff. I had a thing that was an animation pitch, and then I decided, okay, I'm gonna write this as a novel. And when I started to do it, I realized, wait a minute,
there's a reason why you envisioned it that
right,
way.
Because as a cartoon, you can hand wave away all kinds of stuff that as a novel you have to explain. That the world building is to be there, and it kind of matters now, because the audiences require different things from them, and that's a challenge where you can write yourself into a corner pretty quickly.
Well, and also it's to what you are wanting to communicate or what part of your voice matches with, as the story with a certain medium.
Yeah. Dude does cool flip over somebody and shoots them with gun, looks cool in animation or in comics and sounds stupid in prose, or like doesn't work out quite the same way. Rob, there was a thing you talked about too. You mentioned the mystery subscription boxes. Have you guys seen those? Like you can get the subscription boxes.
We get one. Christopher hasn't opened Sherlock Holmes's letters in like 6 weeks.
What I think is interesting about those, though, is that especially with a younger audience coming up that are digital natives, right? They've always had digital, and now they want something more tactile. Yeah. So in a lot of ways, they want experiential types of things. Or paper books, right. So sometimes that change it goes the opposite direction than what you expect. I'm going to take a couple of minutes and talk about some of those different things. So I definitely had that like in the list of stuff to talk about. But there's a lot of different platforms that are kind of out and about, and I want to see. I want basically hot takes here. Like, you're like, it's something that like that if you are aware of it and, know much about it. Like, for instance, there's Wattpad. Have you guys heard of Wattpad? It's like the social storytelling platform. It's this kind of oddball, website and app experience for reading things that has suddenly gotten a bunch of indie authors optioned and stuff. What do you guys know about that? What's your experience with that?
Somebody put one of my books up there without my permission.
Oh, no, really?
Wow.
Like, how did
we don't like them then.
No. Well, I mean, and what we used it to release the first two, the short stories about Lois Lane, my publisher wanted to use because a lot of teens do use it for fan fiction and storytelling and those sort of things, but it does have a little bit of a piracy problem.
Yeah, I did not know that. That's wild.
I was just at Tucson Festival of Books a couple weeks ago, and I met an author who, up to that point, had just been an online friend, and we got to talk for an evening, and he, his latest book, he had been posting to Wattpad. He posted like the whole thing. It's like an enormous horror novel, like a big, big, long one, and it got like tons of traction on there apparently. And he does not have a publisher, but he already has a movie deal for it. And he's a guy that has some cred, and he's got writing chops, and he's got publishing credits. But like that kind of blew my mind that sort of thing could even like happen at this point. So because Wattpad is, before that conversation 2 weeks ago, literally wasn't on my radar, other than seeing the name once in a while.
Are you guys familiar with Radish? Have you seen that platform?
Never heard of it.
So Radish is an app that tells serialized storytelling where you get just chunks of story, like maybe even like 500 words at a time or something. And the writers are literally delivering episodic stuff maybe 3 times a week. It caters heavily to romance and urban fantasy and sexy erotic stories. But it's gained some traction. There's a few different publishers that are kind of behind it too. In fact, I think it's a couple of the publishers who directly own it. It seems like a really oddball platform. I looked into it, and a lot of it's kind of sloppily written. And I think almost by design because it's so fast. I mean, do you guys know much about that one?
I think they contacted me, and I was like, I'm busy.
I think the concept is interesting in terms of like serialized mobile fiction that you can read on your phone in little chunks. I mean, I think that's really interesting. I think for me, it's, and I don't know too much about this. I haven't investigated it too much, but it's kind of about how they're monetizing it and really what readers want. I feel like I've been doing this long enough that like the podcast thing, when we came up with it, seemed like a really cool idea, and it was ahead of its time, I guess. But at the same time, in the meantime, I was looking at like, okay, I can make a blog and I can put chapters of a book up and I can do all that. See, we have the ability to put all this stuff out there. But the question is, how are you going to make money doing that? Because really that's what you want at the end of the day, is you want to be able to tell your stories and make money doing it. You could do something like Patreon. And I have friends that do that, especially artists and stuff. But I mean, I'd be curious in trying something like that. But I just kind of want to know, like, what do people want to read? Do they want paper books? Are people reading on their phones? And that's the part that I don't know yet. If I thought people were going to read a whole novel on their phone, and I mean,
people do.
Yeah. I mean, like, if there's enough of it, then I'd definitely try it.
Yeah. It's funny, we actually, at Mysterious Press, we met with Radish. They were like one of the 6 or 7 companies that wanted to work with us and had like this really cool mobile platform, and then it just didn't work out. In part because our rights situation and the way the rights situations work out with the app is weird. Like, if we only have certain countries, but the app has to be worldwide and you can't do carve-outs. But Radish, to me, and I haven't paid enough attention to it since, but it just seemed like it was one of those companies that came in really strong and like bought us a bunch of drinks and was like, we're going to change publishing. And then it was like, see ya.
Yeah, that's hard.
Yeah. Well, and I hear so many of those. Like when you mentioned Serial Box, in the back of my head, I went, oh, they haven't gone out of business yet.
And actually, not only have they not gone out of business, they just raised $4.5 million and announced they're working with Marvel.
Well, and that's like, and it's just, and because I hear of so many of the like serialized things coming out, like that's kind of my automatic response.
Yeah, but I hear you because when I worked with them the first time, I was like, well, we'll see if they're around. You know what I mean? But they do seem like very smart people, and they're making all these big brand partnerships now that I think will bring in a new audience for this library of stories they've built up.
Well, and I'm super interested to see if it's sustainable.
And they pay well.
And that's
the other thing. They treat writers really well. I mean, I do think when we talk about these new media storytelling options, like a lot of them want to pay writers peanuts or not fair rates. And so finding the ones who will actually invest is really important.
Which can also be a double-edged sword because Great Jones Street, which was they were great. They were this app that was going to do. They were doing mobile fiction. Like they bought like 5 or 6 of my short stories, and then they had me write a short story for them, and they paid really, really nice rates. Like they paid me a good chunk of money. Yeah. And then they went out of business because they were paying their writers too much money. They raised so much money.
You want somebody who's smart,
and they were smart people who just kind of
didn't have a business model. Smart, but not business smart.
Yes,
that's a big problem in publishing.
There's also, I mean, sometimes if you find those tech startups and people like that, they think a different type of way.
Oh yeah,
and they I did paid comics work for a major like software as a service company and charged them what I would have paid to develop a website essentially. And so my per page rate was insane, but they didn't know it any different. Sure. You know? So
always the moral of the story is always charge the highest rate you can.
Right. Yeah. They didn't blink. So you're like, okay, let's do that thing. The last thing I want to ask about, and we're going to wrap up here in a second, is live experiential kinds of things. We've seen this movement, especially from like podcasts now are making this break into live theater again. You've got like your Welcome to Night Vales and stuff like that. They're out doing tours and actively taking their story into that live setting again. Have you guys thought about any of that kind of thing for your stuff? Pattern Mage is probably a little hard to pull off, like in a live setting. A little bit. I don't know. Maybe like snorting a little.
Yeah,
like,
it comes out on stage.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, it might be kind of rough. I mean, but has that figured into any of your thought processes at all?
Man, I would love to do a Wormwood tour. A reunion tour, because at this point it's like a 12-year-old show. But I'd have to get all those actors back, but that would be fun. I would love to try something like that. I think that is a great way to keep that audience going. I know people who listen to Night Vale and then they love it when they comes to town. It's like your band coming to town. It's awesome.
Yeah.
So I think if there's a way to monetize that and make it work for you, I think it's awesome. I don't know.
Cher Martinetti, who's one of the people interviewing people on the live stage, and you should all go watch her. And I have a podcast called Cult Faves about cults. And part of our kind of long-term goal plan is to do live shows at some point.
I'm trying to write a play right now with a friend, and it's the most ridiculous idea we ever had. It's a take on Waiting for Godot, but it's 2 hipsters waiting for the G train. Which if you're from New York City, you know the G train never shows up. And we got really drunk one night. We're like, this is the most brilliant idea we've ever had, and we've been trying to write it, and it's not. But it's fun.
Yeah.
So
sometimes that's what you need.
Yeah. It's like this fun little side thing where it's like, you know what? Like if we can write this thing and make it somewhat bearable, like we actually wanna do like pirate readings like on the subway,
fun.
Like advertise it to like our fans, and then just like at like 1 o'clock in the morning go onto the G train and like act it out. We actually have to make it not bad first.
Like flash theater?
Yeah.
Like, these be like flash mobs, not flash theater?
Yeah, essentially.
Yeah, that's awesome.
But by the way, I do want to throw this out there is that one of the inspirations for Wormwood, I said I was listening to podcasts. The other thing is that I went on a date. My date took me to, and she's now my fiance. But
congratulations.
but she took me to this thing. It was called the Theater of the New Ear. It was at UCLA, and this is years ago. And what it was is composer Carter Burrell had teamed with, I'm going to forget who it is now, the Coen brothers, and who did adaptation and all those.
That guy.
Linking, yeah, that guy.
That Oscar-winning screenwriter.
Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind. Charlie Kaufman? Yes, thank you. Okay. I always lose that. So one play was a Charlie Kaufman play, and one was a Coen Brothers play. They were both done as live readings with live Foley and with live music. Wow. And it was amazing. So you had, and it was like Hope, the second one I remember, it was the Charlie Kaufman script. It was called Hope Leaves the Theater, and it was Peter Dinklage, Hope Davis, and Meryl Streep.
Oh my God.
Wow.
That's a hell of a cast.
Yeah,
So shoot for that. Try to make your version
But
of
like,
that.
I've never forgotten that. You
Yeah.
know, I've never forgotten what an experience that was. So now, you know, when you're talking about these tours and stuff like that, I have to go back to that was this put together as this live music, live Foley. They had a guy on stage walking around in high heels, you know, doing all the live Foley stuff that you see in the old radio shows and
that's
stuff.
great.
It was really amazing.
So many different options that are out there in digital, in paper, on the stage. Please give some love to our panelists here. Thank you so much for joining us here at Emerald City. Have a great rest of your show. The home for all Fictitious episodes, reviews, news, and more is fictitiouspodcast.com. Follow the show on Twitter and Instagram, where I post as Fictitious Pod. I share lots of writing and book info, along with new episodes and event news. And you can also interact with me directly on Twitter, where I'm generally posting about books and general geekery as @Adron Buske. You can subscribe to Fictitious on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, and Spotify. Podcasts live and die by the support of our listeners. If you enjoy this program, please share your favorite episodes on social media, tell your friends, and write a review on your podcast service of choice. You'll be helping me grow the show and supporting the authors who join me to share their stories and writing knowledge. When you do write a review, drop me a line and let me know so that I can thank you personally. I'm Adron Buske. Thanks for listening to Fictitious.